Hey, another quick video on trend lines. If you're using the auto trend line study, you can see this gray line here is the top line, and this gray line here is the secondary line, which just got broken through, so that'll get redrawn. And this is the line that you would use to draw secondary lines in. What I wanted to talk about is when I delete them, when they're no longer relevant. And that's when you have a new peak. It's only the peak that's relevant. And so once this peak is taken out, the next ones aren't, except for maybe the top one. You know, if it rockets through and then retests that one, then it's still a valid historical trend line. But once this peak is taken out, all of these other lines are invalidated. So for example, I have this line here, which was back when this was the peak, you know, until it broke through here. This line was still valid, and it was still useful for seeing, you know, when it was being respected here, and if price had come back down to touch it, then, you know, that's a valid line to use for it. But because this peak was it's no longer the top of where this line goes, because this is the secondary peak here, not this one anymore, and it hasn't been for a while. So like you can see, these ones are still there, but this line right here is no longer valid. So this is one of the ones that I'll delete, because there's higher up lines above it. So once this line was broken, this line then becomes invalidated for future price testing. But all of these ones are still valid, because this is still the peak, this is still the top line for this time period, and that means that, you know, you can still watch price interacting with these levels. You know, I mean, you can definitely see price breaking through, testing it again. Like each one of these dashed diagonal lines is a potential test area. And I actually got into a trade down here because this is the 50% opening range. And when it bounced up and retested this line, I knew that it was safe to stay in. And so it comes up here, retests this line, never actually makes it back down to this line, which tells me to stay in. And then, you know, same thing as it keeps going up through here. Eventually it's going to come back up to this line, which is the highest one, and this one's been fairly well respected today. And at some point, if the upward trend continues, this should get a pretty violent upward break. Either that, or it's going to get another violent rejection like this one. But all of these trend lines are still valid until we get one that's above. So like this trend line right here, this is an auto trend that gets drawn in. Sometimes I'll draw these in manually, just to see where price is, where, you know, I'll often copy them and then make them dash to know that let myself know that it's broken. And then once this price action up here gets to a point where it breaks through this upper line here, if this breaks through this upper line, then this one becomes invalidated, because this peak is no longer the active secondary peak. It would be whatever the next one is that broke through. So this line would no longer be useful, and then at that point you'd want to remove it. So this is how I've used trend lines and how they've been really useful for me. Some of these lines will sometimes get respected. Like if this is a general trend and this was the peak from a ways back, then these lines can stick around for days. Sometimes, you know, like I've had them before where a line like this one will still be active, and there's no reason to delete it. And after a few days, I'll just make it bigger and less noticeable. So I'll switch it to a different size, and I'll actually go back in here and change the transparency to knock it down a bit. And then that's how I know that this is a multi-day active trend line that's still valid. But I do have to go through and make sure that I delete all of my old trend lines. And a lot of the ways I'll do this, if I have a trend line that's active, is I'll just go in here and redraw it as a channel, and then pop it up to the latest upward trend. And I wouldn't do it with this one because this hasn't obviously been multi-day. But once I do that, if I want to go in and remove all of these other trend lines, it becomes very easy to go into the remove drawings trend lines, because It's not going to remove my channels. It's just going to remove the trend lines, so I can get rid of those pretty easily, and then clean up my chart quite a bit. So that's how I use trend lines and how old trend lines can get invalidated.